The barn stood 11 miles east of town, its boards silvered by 3 decades of weather, and inside it the cold had teeth. It was the kind of January morning when breath hung in the air like something solid, when the water trough had frozen clean through to the bottom, and when a 19-year-old girl with $11 folded in the toe of her boot knelt on packed dirt beside the ribs of a wagon that the whole county had agreed, long ago, to forget. Her hands were raw from 3 weeks of prying nails loose in weather that punished bare skin for every minute it stayed uncovered. She had stopped feeling her fingertips somewhere around the 2nd week, had learned to work by watching them rather than trusting what they told her. Beside her lay a pile of stripped planking, dark with old grease and older smoke, and beneath where the wagon bed had been, a section of flooring sat different from the rest, heavier in the hand, tighter in the grain, the kind of wrongness that only someone who had spent a childhood reading wood would ever notice at all. She had not told anyone what she suspected. There was no one left to tell. $11. That was the sum a signed paper had allowed her, the whole of what remained after a freight yard built by her grandfather's hands had been sold out from beneath her on a Tuesday morning, calm as a church service, by an uncle who felt no need to raise his voice to do it. $11, one heirloom carried close against her ribs, and a wrecked, burn-shouldered wagon that had belonged to a teamster 6 years dead, a man the town still called a drunk and a cheat whenever his name came up at all, which was not often and never kindly. She did not yet know, kneeling there with frost silvering the hair at her temples, that what lay beneath that false floor would force the whole county to reconsider everything it had decided about a dead man's character. She did not know that it would decide her own future as surely as it would restore his. She knew only the weight of the plank under her palm, and the particular quiet of a barn at the far edge of nowhere, and the small, stubborn certainty her grandfather had planted in her years before he died. That wood never lies to a person patient enough to listen to it. That certainty was the only inheritance anyone had left her. It would prove, before the frost broke, to be worth considerably more than the freight yard she had lost. But to understand how a girl came to be kneeling alone in a frozen barn with $11 to her name, prying at a stranger's wagon like it held the answer to her whole life, you must go back before the uncle, before the signed paper, back to a smaller girl in a wheelwright's yard, learning to listen to wood long before she understood why it mattered. Settle in and stay close. And before you go further, tell us where you're listening from tonight. The year she turned 7, the fever came through the valley the way it always did in late summer, riding in on the irrigation ditches and the standing water behind the mill, and it took her mother on a Tuesday and her father 4 days later, so close together that the same undertaker measured them both from memory rather than asking twice. She did not remember much of that week with any clarity, only the smell of vinegar rags and the low voices of neighbor women in the kitchen, and the particular silence of a house where no one is cooking anything anymore. What she remembered clearly, the thing that stayed sharp when so much else had gone soft with time, was the ride out to her grandfather's place 3 days after the second funeral, sitting in the bed of a borrowed wagon with a trunk half her size and a woman she barely knew, telling her, not unkindly, that she would be looked after now. Her grandfather met the wagon in his yard without ceremony. He was a wheelwright by trade, a broad, deliberate man with sawdust, worked so permanently into the creases of his hands that it seemed less like dirt than like something grown there, and he had buried a wife of his own some years before, and had learned, in that burying, not to waste words on grief that words could not touch. He did not tell her he was sorry. He did not tell her it would be all right. He lifted her trunk down himself, set it inside the cottage door, and told her that supper was at 6, and that she was welcome to it, whether she was hungry or not, because a person ought to sit at a table, even on the days the food tastes like nothing. The freight yard cottage sat at the edge of his shop, close enough that she fell asleep most nights to the sound of his mallet, a sound she came to find, within a season, more comforting than silence. The yard itself was a small kingdom of wheels, spokes drying in racks, iron tires cooling in a trough, the sweet resinous smell of hub grease mixed with cut oak and hickory, a smell she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life, the way other people carried the smell of their mother's kitchen. He did not fuss over her. He did not ask her to talk about what had happened, and for a long while she did not, and he seemed to understand that a child grieves the way wood seasons, slowly, unevenly, and worse if you rush it. It was in that yard, among the shavings and the quiet, that she first began to notice him running his palm flat along a length of oak, before he'd say a word about it, and she began, without knowing she was beginning anything at all, to watch his hands the way other children watched their fathers' faces. There was a stool in the corner of that shop, low and three-legged, its seat worn shiny by decades of use before she ever sat on it, and it became, without either of them ever saying so, hers. She would perch there through the long afternoons, with her knees drawn up under her chin, watching him work, and he would talk the whole time, as though she were another tradesman, standing at his elbow, rather than a girl of 7, then 8, then 9, still small enough to swing her feet above the floor. He narrated everything. He would turn a spoke in his hands and say, "This one's got a twist in the grain, see there, and a twist like that will fight you for 30 years, and then snap in the worst weather you can imagine, so best to find it now, while it costs you nothing but a look." He would run linseed oil into a hub with a rag blackened from 100 such rubbings, and say the wood drinks when it's thirsty, and refuses when it's not, same as a horse. And a man who can't tell the difference has no business calling himself a wheelwright. She did not understand, at first, that he was teaching her anything at all. She thought he was only talking to himself in her direction, the way some men hum. It took her the better part of 2 years to notice that he waited, sometimes, after he said a thing, and looked at her sideways to see whether she'd caught it, and that when she pointed once, unprompted, at a fellow stacked crooked in the rack, and said that one's warped, isn't it, before he'd said a word, his face did something she did not yet have a name for, something quiet and pleased, that he tried, not quite successfully, to hide behind his mustache. The shop smelled always of raw oak shavings curling pale off his draw knife, and of the sharper, cleaner smell of linseed oil warmed by a low stove in winter, and underneath both of those, always, the iron smell of the tire irons cooling in their trough of water, hissing faintly, a smell she came to associate so completely with safety that for the rest of her life the scent of hot iron and wet ash would loosen something in her chest before she could name why. His mallet kept a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat, 3 strikes and a pause, 3 strikes and a pause, and she fell asleep to it, and woke to it, and measured whole seasons of her childhood by the particular sound of oak giving way under a well-placed blow, never once suspecting how much she was memorizing, or how far from that quiet little shop the memorizing would one day carry her. It began, as most true lessons do, without either of them naming it a lesson at all. He would set her on an upturned crate beside the workbench and hand her a spoke, not yet shaped, still rough with saw marks, and tell her to knock on it with her knuckle and listen. She did not understand, the first dozen times, what she was listening for, and he did not explain, only nodded or shook his head, once, slow, like a man weighing grain at the mill. "Sound wood," he told her eventually, "answers you back. It rings, small and clean, almost like a struck cup. Rotten wood answers dull. It swallows the sound instead of giving it back to you." She practiced on scraps for a summer before she could tell the difference with any confidence, and even then she mistrusted her own ear, so he would test her, hand her 2 spokes, outwardly identical, weathered the same gray, and ask her which one he ought to trust his weight to. She learned to close her eyes when she knocked, the way he did, as though sight only got in the way of hearing properly. He taught her the grain next, running his thumb along a plank held up to the window light, showing her how true grain traveled the length of the wood in long, faithful lines, like a road that knew where it was going, and how false grain wandered and crossed itself, hiding weakness under a handsome finish. "A wagon built on false grain," he said, "will carry you fine across level ground and betray you exactly once, on the one grade that matters, at the one moment you cannot afford it." She did not yet know how literally she would come to understand that sentence, years later, in a country he had never traveled and could not have imagined. He showed her, too, how a wagon's true condition rarely announced itself in the places a buyer's eye went first, the paint, the polish, the brightness of the ironwork, but in the quiet places, the underside of the bed, the hidden run of a floorboard, the joints no one thought to examine, because examining them required getting down in the dirt and looking up instead of admiring from a comfortable distance. A dishonest wagon, like a dishonest man, he told her, keeps its truth low down, where decent people don't think to look. She turned that phrase over for years without fully understanding it, the way a child repeats a hymn before she has any notion what redemption means, and it was only much later, in a cold barn with a lantern and a crowbar, that the sentence would return to her whole and complete, no longer a phrase memorized but a fact lived. For now it was only afternoons, oak shavings, the knock of a small knuckle against old wood, and a grandfather listening for the sound of her getting it right. The seasons in that yard moved the way they moved everywhere in that country, but she came to know them by particular signs that had nothing to do with almanacs. Spring announced itself in the smell of linseed oil warming in the sun, the barrels of it standing along the south wall where her grandfather kept them, and in the return of the swallows that nested under the eaves of the wagon shed and dropped their pale mess on whatever was foolish enough to sit uncovered beneath them. Summer was the hour after noon, when the heat came up off the packed earth in visible waves, and the men took their dinner in the shade of the loading dock, and she was sent with a tin dipper to the well, because a girl of 10 could be trusted with water in a way she could not yet be trusted with a chisel. Autumn brought the smell of wood smoke from the blacksmith's forge, carried on a wind that had turned, finally, cool enough to bear, and with it, the first hard cider from the Larsons' orchard 2 miles east, which her grandfather drank in small glasses on the porch while he oiled his tools before winter closed the shop. And winter itself was the long, quiet stretch when the yard went still and the work moved indoors, when frost feathered the inside of the window panes by morning, and she sat wrapped in a blanket that had been her mother's, watching her grandfather's hands work by lamplight, patient as a season changing. It was in one of those winter evenings, the wind working at the shutters and the stove ticking as it cooled, that she first noticed the small strangeness she would carry for years without an answer. The men in town, the merchants, the freight agents, even the minister on occasion, spoke of the teamster Amos Held the way people speak of weather that has ruined a crop, with a kind of settled, communal disgust that required no fresh evidence to sustain it. Swindler, they called him, and worse, though never within her hearing anything specific enough to explain the charge, only the tone, passed hand to hand, like a coin worn smooth from handling. Her grandfather never joined that chorus. He would go quiet when Held's name came up, set down whatever he was holding, and say only that a man ought not be judged entirely by the noise made around his memory. Once, when she asked him directly whether Held had truly cheated the freight company as everyone claimed, he was a long time answering, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, and then he said only that some men are convenient to blame, because blaming them costs nothing and asks nothing of anyone else. She did not understand the sentence any better than she understood the one about dishonest wagons keeping their truth low down, but she noted, the way a careful child notes the placement of a hidden nail, that her grandfather's silence on the subject was itself a kind of statement, and she filed it away with all the other unfinished things a household teaches a girl to keep, unspoken, until their season comes. The winter she turned 14 came in hard and stayed, the kind of cold that split fence posts in the night with a sound like a rifle shot, and her grandfather kept the shop stove burning long past dark because the glue would not set otherwise, and because, she suspected, he liked the company of the fire as much as she did. She remembers the evening exactly for reasons she would not understand until years later. The wind working at the tin roof, the smell of linseed oil and scorched coffee, the particular blue-white color the window glass took on when the temperature dropped low enough to frost the inside of the pane. He had been quiet most of the evening, working a spoke down to true with a draw knife, and when he finally set the tool aside, he did not pick up another. Instead, he reached into the deep pocket of his work apron, the one he never let her mend because he said a patched apron was a dishonest apron, and drew out a folding rule cased in brass, worn to the color of an old coin along its hinges, the numerals softened by handling until they were more felt than read. He did not hand it to her right away. He turned it over once in his own palm first, as though weighing it, or perhaps saying some private goodbye to it, and then he set it in her hand and closed her fingers over it himself, which was not a thing he did, not a man given to touching a person more than duty required. A tool remembers every hand that has used it honestly, he told her, and she waited for him to explain what that meant, the way he usually followed such sentences, with a plainer one for her benefit. But this time, he let it stand alone, as if the words themselves were the whole of the lesson, and any further explanation would only diminish them. She turned the rule over in the lamplight, opened it, felt the small resistance of the joints, worn smooth but not loose, the mark of long care rather than neglect. She kept it in the pocket of her own apron from that night forward, and in the years that followed she came to understand, slowly, the way a child understands most things that matter, that he had given her more than brass and hinge pin. He had given her a standard to measure herself against, a small cold weight against her hip that asked, every time her hand found it, whether the day's work had been honest enough to deserve carrying it. She did not yet know how soon she would need to answer that question for herself, alone, with no one left to ask it of her but the tool itself. The following autumn, he began to slow in ways she noticed before he spoke of them, a hitch in his breath when he bent to check an axle, a longer pause before he lifted the hammer, and she began, without being asked, to carry the heavier end of every task, the lifting, the hauling, the climbing beneath the wagon beds, where the dust settled thick in a girl's hair, but did him no good at all in his knees. He said nothing about it, and she said nothing about it, and this was itself a kind of conversation between them, the way silence sometimes carries more freight than speech. Then, on a night in early December, with the first hard frost already whitening the fence rails by dusk, he went to bed early, complaining only of a tiredness he called ordinary, and did not wake. She found him in the gray hour before sunrise, the yard still and rimed with cold, the tools in the shop hanging exactly where he had left them, and she would say, in later years, that the strangeness of that morning was not grief exactly, not yet, but the wrongness of a place so full of his marks, and so empty of him, his coffee cup on the sill, his coat on the peg, the folding rule she now carried worn smooth in a pocket that had once been his. The yard did not stop working. Freight did not care that a man had died in it, but she moved through those first days as though the ground itself had gone soft beneath the wheel ruts, every familiar sound, the ring of the anvil, the creak of a hub being fitted, arriving a half-second late, as if the world had not quite caught up to what it now lacked. Her uncle arrived within the week, summoned by letter and by law, a brisk, capable man from the county seat, who wore his grief, if he carried any, folded neatly beneath his coat, where it would not interfere with business. He walked the yard with a ledger under his arm rather than a hammer in his hand, counting wagons, counting debts, counting the value of a place he had not built, and did not especially love. And he spoke to her kindly enough, in the flat, competent tone of a man settling an estate, rather than mourning a brother. He told her the yard would need managing now, that arrangements would be made, that she was young yet, and there was time to decide what became of her. She listened, and nodded, and said little, because she had already learned, from the man now gone, that the wrongest moments were often the ones that asked the most patience of a person, and that patience, unlike grief, was a thing she still knew how to give. The 4 years that followed did not announce themselves as 4 years. They arrived the way seasons arrive to those who work outdoors, not as dates on a calendar, but as the particular ache that settles into the hands before the first frost, as the way the light through the yard's east gate grew long, and then short, and then long again, over and over, until the counting of it seemed a foolish exercise better left to men with ledgers. She rose before her uncle's household stirred, and she was in the yard grinding axle grease into her knuckles, while the rest of the county still lay abed, and she was there still when the lamps were lit behind the kitchen window, and someone called, not unkindly, that supper was cooling. She learned to set a tire hot onto a wheel without scorching the fellies, to judge the health of a hub by the sound it made under a mallet, to read a coming storm in the particular stillness of the mules before it broke. All of it labor a hired man would have been paid a wage for, and all of it hers to give, without one. Her uncle was not cruel in the way the county gossips might have wished, telling the story over supper tables for the drama of it. He was something colder and harder to name, a man who kept her the way he kept an old wagon still serviceable enough not to sell. Out of a duty he never dressed up as affection. He said as much, more than once, in the flat voice he used for figures and debts, that she was fed and housed because family sought a family, that this was simply what was owed, nothing more asked and nothing more given. She heard it the way one hears rain on a roof after enough years, present, unremarkable, no longer worth flinching at. The other hands came and went, seasonal men with seasonal wages, and she watched them paid in coin at the end of each month, while she was paid in the arrangement itself, in the roof and the food, and the cold accounting of obligation, and she said nothing, because saying something had never once in her memory changed the shape of a ledger. She grew taller in those years, and her hands grew harder, and the whistle her grandfather had given her hung always at her collar, worn smooth now by 4 winters of her thumb, finding it in the dark before sleep, the one object in the whole wide yard that belonged to no one's accounting but her own. She did not count the years passing so much as she counted the wheels she had trued, the tongues she had reset, the small silent proofs of a craft no one in that household thought to call by its name. And so it went, spring folding into frost and frost into spring again, until the morning her uncle came into the yard not with a wagon needing repair, but with a paper needing her signature, and a look on his face that told her, before he spoke a single word, that the arrangement, whatever it had ever truly been, was drawing itself to a close. But that morning had been building for longer than she knew, in ways she would only later learn to read the way her grandfather had taught her to read the grain of a plank, by looking backward from the crack to find where the strain had first begun. For nearly 2 years by then, her uncle had been keeping company with a man who came through the yard on a gelding too fine for freight work, dressed in a coat the color of good tobacco, his boots clean, in a place where clean boots did not last past the second step. He came first as a customer, then as something closer to a fixture, arriving on no fixed schedule, but always welcomed, always given the good chair by the stove, always spoken to in the particular soft voice her uncle used when he was calculating rather than conversing. She did not know his name for money, only for road tolls, for he was a man of standing, with the regional company that set the gates and collected the fares on the turnpikes threading out of the county, the roads every freighter and rancher and grain hauler had no choice but to use if they wished their goods to reach the rail depot before the goods spoiled or the season turned. He spoke of assessments and schedules and rights of way, the way other men spoke of weather, as though the numbers were simply given by nature and not written by any hand at all. Her uncle listened to him with an attention he rarely gave to anyone, nodding along at figures she could not follow, and did not think, then, to try to follow, being occupied with wheel hubs and axle grease, and the small honest labor that filled her days. She noticed, without understanding what she noticed, that after these visits, her uncle's ledgers went into the strong box rather than the open shelf, and that certain conversations stopped the moment her step sounded on the porch board that always creaked. She noticed the partner's gaze pass over her the way a man's gaze passes over a piece of yard furniture, present, accounted for, requiring no further thought, and she did not resent it, for she had long since stopped expecting to be seen by men of that sort. What she did notice, and did carry with her, though she could not yet say why, was the ease between the two of them, an ease built not on friendship exactly, but on some shared arithmetic she was not permitted to see the sum of. The toll gates themselves she had passed 100 times behind a hauling team, paying whatever figure was posted without question, the way one pays for weather. It would be a long while yet before she understood that a road, like a wagon, could hide its true weight beneath a floor built specifically to be believed. The Tuesday came without weather worth remembering, which she would later find strange, for she had always believed a day like that ought to announce itself with wind or hard rain, some outward sign to match what was happening inside the house. Instead, the sky sat pale and ordinary over the yard, and the frost had already burned off the fence rails by the time her uncle called her into the small office that smelled of tallow and old paper, and asked her to sit, and opened a ledger she had never been shown before, though she had dusted its cover 100 times. He did not raise his voice. He did not look away from her either, which she would remember as the stranger detail, for she had expected shame to require averted eyes, and his did not avert. He turned the ledger so that it faced her, and with the flat of one finger he walked her down a column of figures. Years of board, he said, and keep, and the cost of goods a growing girl requires that a household does not always account for at the time. All of it totaled now against 19 years of labor that he did not enter into the column at all, because labor, he said, was not the kind of thing a ledger was built to hold. He told her, in the same voice he might have used to report a shipment delayed by weather, that the freight yard had been sold. The papers were signed. The new owner would take possession within the fortnight. He had, he said, seen to her account, and after the deductions proper to the years of her keep, the sum remaining came to $11, which he counted out from a tin box onto the table between them, one bill and then the coins atop it, arranging them the way he might arrange change for a stranger buying feed. She looked at the money, without touching it for a moment longer than was polite, and in that moment she understood that no unkindness had been intended, that this was simply how the account had always been going to close, that she had been a line item all along, and had only now been totaled. He did not apologize, because there was, in his accounting, nothing to apologize for. He slid a paper across the table, a release, he called it, a formality, so that no one might say later the matter had not been settled fair and square, and he waited, pen already uncapped, while she read it once, understanding perhaps a third of the language, and signed it anyway, because there was no other door out of that room that did not pass through her own signature. Only afterward, walking out past the porch board that always creaked, did she notice that the yard beyond looked exactly as it had the day before, the same wheels leaning against the same fence, the same dust settling in the same slant of light, as though 19 years could be closed out on paper without the world troubling itself to look any different at all. $11, he counted out to her on the table's scarred surface, and he counted them the way he counted everything, deliberately, each coin and bill set down with a small, definite click or whisper, as though the sound itself were a form of proof, as though a man who counted so carefully could never afterward be accused of shorting anyone. She did not touch the money at first. She only looked at it, arranged there in the thin morning light coming through the window glass, and thought that it was strange how small a sum could look, and how large it had felt spoken aloud the night before, when it was still only a number, and not yet a fact laid out in coin. He pushed it toward her with 2 fingers, the way a man pushes something he does not wish to be responsible for touching twice, and said that it squared them, that no one could say otherwise, that she was owed nothing further, and owed nothing further herself, and that this, in his understanding, was the cleanest kind of ending a family business could come to. He did not look unkind saying it. That was the part she would carry longest, that his face held no cruelty in it at all, only the mild satisfaction of a ledger brought finally into balance. She gathered the coins into her palm, feeling their cold, and put them into the small cloth purse her mother had once used for egg money, the drawstring gone soft and gray with handling. Into her satchel went the 2 dresses she owned, a spare pair of stockings gone thin at the heel, a folding knife with a bone handle, and, wrapped in a flour sack cloth at the bottom where it would take no bruising, her grandfather's folding rule, the brass fittings worn smooth by his hands and now beginning, faintly, to be worn smooth by hers. She did not carry it because it was valuable. She carried it because it was the only thing left that had ever measured anything true. The morning outside was cold in the particular way of early autumn on the flats, the kind of cold that did not bite so much as settle, seeping up through boot leather and into the bone, and her breath went out from her in pale ribbons that dissolved before she had finished watching them. The street was empty at that hour, save for a dog nosing along the base of the mercantile porch, and a wagon 2 lots down, being loaded by a man who did not look up. She stood a moment on the step, satchel in one hand, purse in the other, and understood with a plainness that surprised her that no one had assigned her anywhere to go, that the town had no next place waiting with her name on it, and that whatever came next would have to be a thing she decided for herself, alone, in the cold, with $11 and a rule that measured wood. The auction had been announced for that same week, a matter of practicality rather than ceremony, the new owner wanting the lot cleared of its last debris before he set his own men to work, and so she walked back toward the yard she had grown up in, not as an heir, but as a spectator, one of a dozen townsfolk drifting along the fence line to see what might be had cheap. There was little enough. A broken harness rack, a stack of iron tire rims gone soft with rust, a grindstone with its handle snapped clean off. The auctioneer moved through the lots with the flat indifference of a man reciting a grocery list, and the bidding, where there was any, rarely rose past $1 or $2. It was in the back corner, past the shed where the good wagons had always been kept, that she saw it. A freight wagon so scorched along one side that its boards had gone the color of a stove left too long untended, its bed sagging where fire had eaten through a crossbeam, one wheel missing entirely, and the axle resting in the dirt like a broken limb. No one stood near it. No one had troubled to move it into better light. She had passed it 100 times as a girl without truly looking, the way a person stops seeing a fence post they walk by every day. But now, with nothing left to occupy her attention and no place yet to be, she found herself walking toward it, as though pulled by something other than curiosity. She knew whose it was before she reached it. Everyone in town knew whose it was. It had belonged to a freighter named Amos Held, dead some 6 years now, a man spoken of in the particular tone reserved for those the town had decided, once and permanently, to be ashamed of. A swindler, some said, though none could name exactly what he had swindled. A drunk, said others, though the 2 or 3 who had known him longest only shrugged when pressed, as if the label had simply attached itself, over time, the way rust attaches to iron left out in weather, without anyone quite recalling how it started. The auctioneer did not so much as call a number on it. He gestured toward it once, said it was fit for nothing but kindling and scrap iron, and moved on to the next lot before anyone could answer him. She stood before it a long moment, satchel still in one hand, purse in the other, and found herself doing the thing her grandfather had taught her, without meaning to do it at all, letting her eye travel the length of the bed, noting where the wood had warped, where it had not, where the burn had eaten deep, and where it had only scorched the surface and left the grain beneath untouched and, if she was not mistaken, unusually thick. It was the blacksmith who spoke first, a big man with forearms scarred pink from 40 years of sparks, standing near the fence rail with his thumbs hooked into his belt, the way men do when they mean to be heard by everyone but address themselves to no one in particular. He said, loud enough to carry past the wagon yard and into the street beyond, that the girl was fixing to buy herself a coffin on wheels, and that old Held's ghost would ride along with it free of charge, and that she ought to save her $11 for something that might yet be useful to her, a hen, perhaps, or a length of good rope. A ripple of laughter went through the small crowd that had gathered more from idleness than from any interest in the sale, the kind of laughter that costs the laugher nothing and asks nothing of him afterward, and several turned to see how she would take it, expecting perhaps a flush of shame or a quick retreat toward the gate. She did neither. She kept her eyes on the wagon bed, on the place where the burn had left a shadow rather than a wound, and said nothing at all, which seemed to disappoint the blacksmith more than any answer could have, for a man who mocks in public wants an audience for his wit, and cannot abide being denied the satisfaction of a reaction. The auctioneer, who had by now grown weary of standing over a lot no one wanted, and eager to move to the wagons with actual value still in them, looked at her with the particular amusement of a man who believes he is doing someone a small kindness by humoring a foolish notion. He asked, half to her and half to the crowd, whether the girl meant to bid at all, or only to stand there admiring the ashes. When she said she would give $1 for it, he laughed outright, the sound short and easy, and said he supposed no one else in the county was fool enough to bid against her, and let the hammer fall before the words had quite finished leaving his mouth, as though eager to be rid of the thing and the whole embarrassment of it in the same motion. And so, for $1 counted out of her 11 and pressed into a stranger's palm, she came to own what the town had already buried in its own mind 6 years past, a scorched, half-collapsed freight wagon with a dead man's name still fixed to it in faded paint along the sideboard. Held Freighting, the letters cracked and peeling, but legible still to anyone who troubled to look, which by all appearances, no one in that yard, save for her, had troubled to do in a very long while. The moving of it took 2 men, a borrowed dray, and the better part of a gray forenoon, and she paid for all 3, out of what remained of her $10, counting the coin into the older man's hand, the same careful way her uncle had once counted money into hers, though she did not let herself dwell long on the resemblance. The wagon would not sit whole upon the dray bed. It had to be chained and dragged in sections along the last stretch where the road narrowed, and the frost that had settled hard over the county in the night made the ground ring under the wheels like something struck, and made the men's breath hang about their heads in pale clouds as they worked, cursing softly at the cold and at the awkward, blackened weight of the thing, though not, she noticed, at her, not once, as if some old habit of respect for a paying customer outlasted whatever they privately thought of her judgment. She had found the barn through a widow on the town's north edge, a dry, low structure with a sound roof and a dirt floor, rented for 50 cents the month, more space than the wreck required, but the only shelter she could afford, that asked no questions about what she meant to do inside it. The 7 miles between the freight yard and that barn took the better part of the day, the dray creeping along frozen ruts under a sky the color of scoured tin, and Delia walked alongside it most of the way rather than ride, partly to steady the chains where they threatened to slip, and partly because the cold seemed easier to bear in motion than sitting still. By the time they reached the barn, the light had gone thin and blue, and the men set the last section down inside with a grunt of finality, and stood a moment slapping their hands together before they took their pay and left her to it, glancing back once or twice at the wagon, the way men glance at something they cannot quite place the sense of being asked to move. She did not explain herself to them, and they did not ask. Alone then, in the gathering dark, she stood before the wreck with her lantern unlit, and her hands raw from the chain and the cold, and she let herself look at it plainly for the first time since the auction, not as a bargain or a spectacle, but as a thing of wood and iron that had once carried a man's living up and down the length of the county, and had outlived him by 6 years in disgrace. The frost was already forming again on the scorched sideboards, fine and silver in the last of the light, settling into the cracks of the faded lettering, as if trying, in its patient wintering way, to erase what remained of the name. She lit the lantern at last, and hung it from the nail her grandfather would have used had he ever stood in this particular barn, and she began. She did not begin with force. That was the first thing he had taught her, standing at his own bench, with shavings curling past his boots, that a wagon does not surrender itself to a man in a hurry. She started at the tailboard, where the burn had eaten shallowest, and ran her palm flat along the grain before she ever lifted a pry bar, feeling for the places where the wood answered her touch, and the places where it did not. Sound wood, he used to say, has a voice in it. You do not hear it with your ears. You hear it with the flat of your hand and the pad of your thumb, and you hear it best when you are not thinking about hearing it at all. The first plank came away with a long tearing groan, the nails crying out of the frame in a register that seemed almost human in the cold, and she set it aside and knuckle-rapped the one beneath it, 3 times, evenly spaced, the way he had shown her on 100 idle afternoons, when she was a girl too small to be useful for anything but listening. A soundboard rang. A rotten one thudded. A board with something behind it, something that was not simply air and old dust, gave back a note that was neither, a flatness, a deadness at the center of the ring, as if the wood were holding its breath. She found 2 such boards before the frost outside had fully claimed the yard beyond the barn door, and she made herself pass over them without comment, the way he had taught her to pass over a thing she suspected, before she had earned the right to be sure of it. Patience first, he always said, confirm twice. A wheelwright who trusts his first guess buries his customers on the road. So she worked outward from the edges instead, plank by plank, her breath fogging white in the lantern light, her knuckles splitting at the first joint from the cold and the repetition, and she did not stop to nurse them. The barn filled slowly with the smell of old char and older cedar, of tallow and rust, and something fainter beneath it all, Dry paper, perhaps, though she would not let herself think the word yet. Each board she freed, she leaned against the stall wall, in the order she had taken it, so that if she was wrong about all of it, she could put the wagon back together, and no one would ever know what foolishness had passed through her mind on a January night, with 19 years, and $11, and a dead man's shame in her hands. By the time the lantern guttered low, she had worked her way to the two flat-sounding boards, and she knelt before them a long moment without touching either one, listening to her own heartbeat instead of the wood. She did not touch the boards that night. She banked what was left of the lantern oil, drew her coat tighter, and told herself the wood would keep till morning, that a wheelwright's granddaughter did not chase a discovery like a hound after a rabbit, half blind with wanting. Her grandfather had said that too, though she could no longer remember the exact words, only the sense of his hand on her shoulder, steadying her before she'd even known she needed steadying. The cold drove her back into town before first light, her fingers too stiff to be of use to anyone, and she went, as she had gone 3 evenings that week already, to the boarding house kept by the widow at the end of Ferris Street, where a fire was always lit in the kitchen stove, and where a body could sit a while, without being asked to pay for the sitting. The old woman set bread in front of her without being asked, and butter that had gone a little too soft by the stove, and she talked while Delia ate, the way she always talked, of the town as it had been, rather than as it was. Amos Held used to bring my flour up from the mill himself, she said, back before any of this trouble. A gentleman about it, too. Always swept the porch step before he'd set the sacks down, so my skirts wouldn't catch the dust. Folks liked him well enough, once. Liked him fine. She turned the poker in the coals, unhurried. It was only after the toll company changed hands that he went sour. Quit smiling at children on the road. Quit coming to service. Folks took that as guilt, I suppose, because it's easier than taking it as grief. Delia said nothing, only turned her cup slowly on the table, feeling the warmth travel up through her split knuckles. I don't say he was blameless, the widow went on. I don't know enough to say that. But I remember a man who swept a step for an old woman's skirts, and I have never once been able to fit that man to the one they buried out past the fence line like something shameful. She looked at Delia then, a long, unhurried look, the kind old women give when they already suspect more than they will ask outright. You've been at that wagon every night this week, child. Frostbite besides. I have, Delia said, and no more than that, because her grandfather had also taught her that a thing not yet proven was a thing not yet spoken, however much the wanting pulled at her tongue. The widow only nodded, as if she understood the shape of a silence, as well as she understood the shape of a loaf, and reached to cut Delia another slice, the knife catching the firelight along its edge, and outside the window the frost lay thick and white and patient over the whole sleeping town. She walked back to the barn that night, with the widow's bread still warm against her ribs, wrapped in a cloth and tucked inside her coat, and she told herself it was only for later, though she knew even as she thought it, that she meant to eat none of it until the work was done. The cold had come down harder than any night that week, the kind of cold that made the barn boards tick and settle, as though the whole structure were drawing its shoulders in against the dark. And she lit her lamp and set it on the upturned crate, and stood a long moment simply looking at the wagon bed, the way her grandfather had taught her to look at any piece of wood before she touched it, not for what it was meant to be, but for what it was. She had stripped the sideboards down to the frame by then, and the bed itself lay bare under the lamplight, gray and split and silvered with age, and she did what she had done every night that week, which was to walk its length slow and even, setting her weight down heel to toe, feeling for the place where a board answered wrong. Most wood, her grandfather used to say, complains in a single voice. It bends and it settles all of a piece, and a man who has handled enough of it stops hearing the difference between the wood and his own bones. But wood that hides something, he'd say, wood built over a gap, speaks in two voices at once, a low groan where the weight passes over solid stock, and above it, quick and thin, almost a click, where the board flexes over air that oughtn't be there. She heard it now. It came from beneath the second cross brace, a sound so slight she might have called it nothing at all, if she had not spent 6 nights teaching her ear to expect it, and she went still, one boot planted on the board, feeling the give travel up through her ankle, faint as a held breath let out slow. She knelt then, setting the lamp close, and ran her palm flat along the grain, and there it was, not a warp, not a shrinkage crack, but a seam, straight as a rule line, where 2 boards had been fitted so carefully that daylight alone would never have shown it, the kind of joinery a man does when he wants a thing found only by someone who already knows to look. She did not reach for a tool yet. She only knelt there in the cold with her hand flat against the wood, the frost creeping white along the nail heads around her, and let herself feel, for one long unhurried minute, the particular quiet that comes just before a thing gives up what it has kept. Then she reached for the pry bar and set its edge into the seam, and began, slow and deliberate, the way her grandfather had always said a true thing should be opened, as though it might still change its mind. The board did not shriek the way old wood is said to shriek in the stories men tell of buried things. It came up with a sound closer to a sigh, the nails long since gone soft with rust, and the plank tilted free into her hands, almost gently, as though it, too, had been waiting a long time to be relieved of what it carried. The lamp threw its small circle of light down into the cavity beneath, and above her, through a knot crack in the barn wall no wider than a finger, a blade of pale winter sun came through and lay across the opening like something laid there on purpose, illuminating a space no deeper than a feed box and no wider than a lap desk, lined at some forgotten hour with oiled canvas gone stiff and dark with age. She did not reach in at once. She had learned that much from her grandfather, too, that the last inch of any true find should never be rushed, that a person owed the moment the same patience they had owed the search. She held the lamp lower, and saw first the corners of 2 ledgers, bound in leather that had once been oxblood red and was now the color of dried tobacco, their spines cracked white where they had been opened and closed 1,000 times by a hand now 6 years still. Beside them lay a folded paper, thicker than a letter, sealed at one time with wax, that had long since crumbled to a dark crumb, its creases gone soft and furred, the way paper goes when it has spent years remembering damp. She lifted the ledgers out first, cradling them the way a person carries something that might come apart if handled wrong, and set them on the barn floor in the full fall of that thin winter light. Frost had crept along the barn seams all through the night, and her own breath went up in a pale ribbon as she crouched over them, and for a moment she only looked, not touched, at the initials tooled small into the leather cover, A.H., worn nearly smooth by a thumb that must have opened this book more times than any man would open a thing he was ashamed of. She reached for the folded paper next, and unfolded it with the same slowness, the same care, feeling the old crease resist and then give, and saw, water-stained but legible, a surveyor's hand, and a county seal, and language she had heard read aloud at the land office more times than she had ever expected to need to understand. She sat back on her heels in the cold, one ledger open on her knee, and did not yet let herself believe what her eyes were already telling her plainly enough. She carried the ledgers to the house that evening, wrapped in a feed sack against the damp, and did not sleep, though she told herself twice that she would, only for a few hours, only to rest her eyes. The lamp burned low, and then she trimmed the wick, and it burned again, and outside the frost thickened on the window glass in ferns and spines, while she sat at the kitchen table, with 14 years of another man's careful hand spread before her. He had written small and close, the way a man writes who is paying for his own paper, and at first the columns meant nothing to her but freight weights and toll fees and dates, a record so ordinary it might have been anyone's accounting. But her grandfather had taught her to read a wagon by what it did not say as much as by what it did, and she found herself reading the ledger the same way, noticing not the numbers themselves, but the places where they did not agree with what she already knew of toll rates posted at every station gate along that road, rates she had passed 100 times without troubling to remember them, until now, when the difference sat plain on the page. The toll company charged by the axle and the load, that much was posted law, and Amos Held had paid it faithfully, year after year, entry after entry, and beside each payment he had written, in a hand grown smaller and tighter as the years went on, the rate he ought to have paid according to the schedule, nailed up at the gatehouse itself, copied out once in full at the front of the first ledger, in ink gone brown with age. The two figures never matched. Not once, in 14 years. Not by a little. Always by more than a little. And always in the same direction. Always more taken than the law allowed, and never once returned. She turned pages until her fingers ached with cold, and her eyes burned with the lamp smoke, and near the back of the third ledger, where the entries grew sparse and dated closer to his death, she found a page of names, men who had signed the toll receipts on the company's behalf over the years, men whose signatures she did not know until she came to one she did, a name she had seen 100 times on freight contracts at her uncle's yard, on the bottom line beside her uncle's own, the name of the man who had stood behind her uncle at the sale of the yard not 2 months past, nodding along as the numbers were read out. She set the ledger down on the table, very carefully, the way a person sets down something that has just told her more than she was prepared to hear, and outside the frost went on climbing the glass, indifferent, and the lamp burned lower still. The man came on the third day after the frost had settled into something permanent, arriving in a buggy too clean for the road it had traveled, drawn by a horse whose coat had been brushed that morning by someone who was paid to brush horses and not much else. He did not knock so much as announce himself, standing in the doorway of the barn, with his hat already in his hand, which she would remember later as the strangest part of the whole encounter, that a man come to buy her silence had thought to be polite about it. He introduced himself as representing the toll road company's interests, a phrase he used more than once, as though repetition might make it mean something other than what it meant. He admired the wagon, he admired the barn. He remarked, in a voice pitched to sound like idle conversation, that old ledgers were peculiar things, full of a dead man's arithmetic that could mean anything or nothing depending on who read them, and that a young woman starting out in the world might find $200 a more useful inheritance than a stack of paper no court would trouble itself over. She did not answer him right away. She went on wiping down the plane she had been using, drawing the rag along its iron sole the way her grandfather had taught her, slow, unhurried, as if the tool mattered more than the man standing in her doorway, and in a way it did. $200, he said again, when the silence had gone on long enough to make him uncomfortable, which she noted without pleasure. Cash money, no papers to sign this time. She set the plane down on the workbench, squared to the edge, the way she squared everything, and told him she had no ledgers to sell him, which was not quite a lie, and not quite the truth either, and which she delivered in the same flat, unhurried tone her uncle had once used to tell her she was 19, and the yard was sold. He studied her face for something, anger, fear, the flicker of a number too low that might be raised, and found none of it, and this seemed to trouble him more than any refusal shouted at him would have. He put his hat back on. He said she should think on it, that offers such as his did not come twice, and she said nothing further, and let him find his own way back out to the clean buggy and the brushed horse, and stood in the doorway of the barn long after the sound of the wheels had faded into the frost-hard road, understanding, without needing to say it aloud to anyone, that she had just closed a door behind her that no one, not even her own doubt, would be able to open again. Spring came late that year, the way it does in country that has been punished by a hard winter, and the thaw arrived not as a gentle loosening, but as a slow, muddy insistence, the roads turning to a soup that swallowed wheels to the hub. She traveled to the county seat in the last week of March, the ledgers wrapped in oiled cloth against the wet, the deed folded flat inside her coat, where she could feel its edge against her ribs the whole distance, a reminder, with every jolt of the wagon, that what she carried could not be replaced if it were lost to a puddle or a careless hand. The courthouse was a squat brick building with tall windows fogged from the press of bodies inside, for spring session drew every man with a grievance or a debt for 50 miles, and she waited 3 days on a bench in the hallway before her turn came, watching lawyers and farmers and a widow with a torn deed of her own pass through the doors ahead of her, each one carrying some smaller version of the same hope she carried. When she was finally called, the room fell into a stillness she had not expected from a place so recently loud with other business. The judge was an older man, with spectacles pushed low on his nose, and a manner that suggested he had heard every kind of lie a county could produce, and had grown patient rather than cynical from the hearing of them. She placed the ledgers on the table before him and the deed beside them, and said only that these belonged to a dead man who deserved his name back, and let the clerk begin to read. The reading took the better part of an hour, the clerk's voice flat and official, moving through years of toll receipts and skimmed percentages and names she recognized from her own town, and the room grew colder with every entry, not from any draft, but from the particular chill that settles over a crowd realizing it has been cheated in plain sight for longer than most of them had been alive. She watched men she knew shift in their seats. She watched her uncle's partner, seated near the back, go the color of old tallow and say nothing at all. The judge removed his spectacles once, cleaned them slowly, and set them back on his nose before asking, in a voice pitched for the whole room to hear, whether the girl before him understood the weight of what she had just placed into the record of the court. She said that she understood it well enough, and that understanding was, in fact, the whole of why she had come. The judge nodded once, as men do when an answer satisfies something beyond the words themselves, and told the clerk to enter the ledgers as evidence, in a matter that would be taken up by the county attorney before the session closed. What followed did not happen quickly, because nothing born of paper ever does. Through the remainder of that spring and into the long, slow burn of summer, men rode out from the capital to sit in the back rooms of the land office with account books spread before them like something being autopsied, and word came back to town in pieces, the way water comes back to a dry creek bed, a trickle first, then more. The toll company's charter was suspended before the wheat was cut. 2 men who collected the gate fees on the eastern stretch were made to answer for sums they could not account for, and neither of them answered well. Her uncle's partner, the quiet man with the ledger-colored voice who had once offered her $200 in a hotel room to forget what she had found, was named outright in the county paper as party to the skimming, his signature discovered on receipts going back 11 years, and within a season his name was no longer spoken at the grain exchange with anything resembling respect. He sold his house before the first snow. Nobody in town seemed to know, or cared to ask, where he went after that. Her uncle himself was named nowhere in the record. Whether this was because he had truly kept his hands clean, or because the partnership had shielded him by the accident of whose name sat on which paper, she could not say, and did not try overly hard to learn. She noted it the way her grandfather had taught her to note a crack in a fellow that was not yet bad enough to fail. With attention, and without alarm, filed away rather than acted upon. He wrote her once, that autumn, a short letter with no apology in it, only an inquiry after her health, and a line about the yard doing well under its new owner, and she answered it in kind, briefly, without warmth and without bitterness either, the way one answers a stranger who happens to share your blood. And Amos Held, 6 years dead and long called a swindler by every idle tongue in the county, had his name entered into the public record that summer as a man who had kept faithful books against men who did not deserve faithful books kept on them, and the paper ran a short notice to that effect on a Thursday, 3 lines long, which she cut out and folded into the bottom of the tin box beside the compass her grandfather had left her. The 60 acres of river-bottom land, once dismissed by men who valued only what a toll road could carry past it, became in 3 years' time a modest yard of her own making, not grand, not much to look at from the county road, but square in its fences and honest in its accounts, which was more than could be said of the yard she had once been paid $11 to leave. She built the first shed herself, with lumber bought a plank at a time from a mill down river that did not know or care whose granddaughter she was, and she set her grandfather's tools along the wall in the order he had always kept them, the draw knife and the spoke shave and the long iron rule, so that reaching for any one of them in the dark felt the same as it had felt at 7 years old, watching his hands instead of her own. Word travels slow in dry country, and slower still when it concerns a woman running freight, but it travels, and by the 2nd year she had 2 wagons of her own on the road between the river and the rail spur, and by the 3rd she had turned away more work than she took, because she would not haul for men who could not tell her honestly what their load weighed, and would not repair a wheel for a customer in a hurry if the wood beneath the paint told her a different story than the one he was telling her. She judged every wagon that came into her yard the way her grandfather had taught her to judge them, by the grain, by the weight, by the small dishonesties that showed themselves in a fellow playing too thin to hide a soft spot, and she was rarely wrong, and when she was wrong, she said so plainly, and adjusted the bill without being asked twice. There were men, at first, who sent their wagons to her only because her rates were low, and did not trouble to hide that they thought little of a woman's eye for iron and ash wood, and there were fewer of those men each season, not because she argued them out of it, but because a wheel she had judged sound held up through a summer of hauling ore and a winter of hauling feed, while a wheel judged sound by someone else did not, and in freighting country, that arithmetic settled arguments faster than any words could. She did not advertise. She did not need to. The yard grew the way her grandfather had once told her a good wagon grows into its purpose, slowly, under load, proving itself 1 mile at a time rather than all at once, and it was in the 4th winter, with frost thick on the fence rails and the river running low and gray, that the first stranger came asking after the woman who had once bought Amos Held's wreck for $1.50. She did not remember, at first, that she knew him, because 6 years had thinned his shoulders and grayed the hair at his temples, and it was only when he set his hat on her workbench and asked, in a voice gone careful in a way she had never heard from him before, whether she still had time to look at a hub before spring hauling, that she recognized the blacksmith who had once laughed loud enough for the whole street to hear it, the day she led a burned wreck of a wagon out of town behind a borrowed mule. He did not mention that day. She did not either. She turned his hub over in her hands the way her grandfather had taught her, thumb along the grain, ear close to the wood as she tapped it, weighing what the eye alone could not tell her, and when she told him the iron was sound but the fellow wanted replacing before the thaw. He nodded the way a man nods who has learned, somewhere in the years between, that a thing said plainly by someone who has earned the right to say it plainly is worth more than a thing shouted by someone who has not. He paid her asking price without asking her to lower it. He was not the last man in that county to come to her workbench with his hat in his hand and his pride left outside the door, and she never once reminded any of them of what they had said about her, because she had learned that a reputation built on silence outlasted one built on argument, the same patient lesson her grandfather had given her over a wheel rim decades before she had any notion of what it would cost her to keep it. She kept his brass caliper rule in the drawer of the workbench her grandfather had built, worn smooth at the edges from 30 years of his hands and then from hers, and she still reached for it first before any tool, when a stranger's wagon came into her yard, trailing dust, and a story nobody had bothered to ask about. She had learned, by then, that the county was full of things called worthless long before anyone troubled to weigh them properly. A burned wagon, a dead teamster's name, a girl handed $11 on a Tuesday morning and told to make her own way, and that the calling of a thing worthless was never really a judgment on the thing itself, only a confession of how little patience the one doing the calling had been willing to spend. She spent hers. That, in the end, was the whole of the inheritance, and it had been enough.